Did you
You
really
can't
think Seoul was
escape.
far enough, Andrew?
Let
The
me
sound of an
go!
open palm
Not
meeting
until you
flesh had
listen.
echoed through the narrow residential street at 7:40 p.m., 90 meters from Jane's apartment building in Mapo-gu, beneath the amber wash of a convenience store sign. Jane was pressed against the cold chassis of a parked car, her white silk blouse twisted in Andrew's grip, his fingers crushing her jaw. She was 6,847 miles from the city where he first broke her, but the smell of his cologne was exactly the same. Familiar. Nauseating. A trigger she could never unlearn. Her natural curls were yanked backward. Her cheek was on fire. Her eyes wide, searching, defiant, even now scanned the dark street for any exit, any witness, anything. There was nothing. He leaned close. "You think a fancy job in Korea makes you untouchable?" He hissed, his olive-brown t-shirt straining across his chest as he tightened his grip. "You belong to me. You've always belonged to me." Then his phone rang. An unknown Seoul number. Andrew froze. He released her, just slightly, distracted by the buzzing screen. And Jane, brilliant, organized, perpetually underestimated Jane, drove her elbow into his ribs and ran. She made it to the elevator. She made it to the 40th floor. She did not make it to the mirror before the tears came. She let them come. 2 minutes, maybe 3, her back against the cold marble wall beneath the window, the city blazing indifferently behind the glass. Then she stood up, because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. The executive bathroom on the 40th floor of Dongtae Group's headquarters was designed to make a person feel powerful. Marble countertops, ambient lighting, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a soul that never truly slept, a galaxy of neon and ambition compressed into a skyline. Jane Wright stood in front of that mirror and felt none of it. Her hands trembled as she pressed the concealer sponge against the bruise blooming across her left cheek, a deep, ugly purple red that no amount of beige pigment was going to fully erase. She worked methodically, efficiently, the way she did everything. The way Dongtae had come to depend on her to do everything: quarterly logistics reports, distribution scheduling, inter-office communications she had never questioned, had never thought to question. Professional, invisible, controlled. That was the arrangement. That was survival. She straightened her white silk blouse, smoothed her curls, and exhaled a breath so shaky it belonged to a different woman than the one she presented to the world. Then she walked out of the bathroom and into the glass corridor of the most powerful private firm in South Korea, and directly into the line of sight of Dongtae. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room, a glass of water untouched on his desk. His dark navy suit was immaculate. His black dress shirt was open at the collar, just enough to reveal the edge of the ink that climbed his throat, dark, intricate patterns that the business world pretended not to notice and the underworld knew to fear. The tattoos continued down his right hand, wrapping over his knuckles like a brand, like a warning written in the only language that truly mattered in this city. He did not turn around immediately. He never rushed. "Good morning, Mr. Dong." Jane's voice was steady. A small miracle. A long pause. He turned. His face was sharp-boned and handsome in the way that expensive, dangerous things often were, and his expression was what it always was. Perfectly, terrifyingly blank. But his eyes traveled to her cheek for exactly 1.5 seconds before returning to hers. He said nothing. He simply looked at her the way a chess grandmaster looks at a board, cataloging, calculating, several moves ahead of everyone else in the room. "The Incheon shipment report," he said quietly. "On my desk by 9. Of course." She turned to leave. "Jane." She stopped. "The coffee this morning," he said, his voice low, almost conversational almost. "Take it with the lights on. Not at your desk." She didn't understand the instruction. She never fully understood the edges of this man. But she nodded, and she sat in the light, and she did not see the moment Dongtae picked up his phone and made the first of 2 calls he would place that day, this one lasting 11 seconds, to a number that did not exist in any corporate directory. She did not need to. By midnight, she would understand everything. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is reaching. Jane Wright had built her life in Seoul the way she built everything carefully, methodically, with no room for error. Her apartment in Mapogu was small but precise. Every surface had a purpose. Her work bag hung on the same hook every night. Her coffee brewed on a timer set for 6:15 a.m. Her commute took exactly 22 minutes door to lobby, and she had memorized every shortcut, every crossing signal, every face that belonged to her routine. Routine was armor. Routine was the thing that stood between her and the version of herself she had left behind in a different country, in a different life, under a different man's hands. Seoul had not been the obvious choice. It had been the only choice. She had applied to Dongtae Group on the strength of a job posting buried deep in an international recruitment site, executive operations coordinator, fluency in English required, discretion expected. The salary had been extraordinary. The location had been the point. Far, unreachable, a city so vast and so indifferent to her history that she could finally breathe without checking over her shoulder. That had been 14 months ago. Now she moved through the 40th floor of the Dongtae Group tower, the way water moves through a familiar channel, effortlessly, invisibly, efficiently. She knew which suppliers called on which mornings. She knew which reports needed to cross Dongtae's desk before he arrived, and which ones he preferred to receive in person. She knew that he took his coffee black, that he read contracts from the last page forward, and that when he went quiet in a meeting, truly quiet, the kind of silence that had weight and temperature, every person in the room stopped breathing until he chose to speak again. She had learned him the way you learn a landscape you intend to survive. Dongtae himself was not a man who invited familiarity. He was 34, though he carried himself with the stillness of someone much older, someone who had already seen every version of every situation and found most of them beneath his full attention. His suits were always dark. His desk was always clear. His instructions were always delivered once, in a voice so measured and low that you had to pay attention, because he was not going to repeat himself. The tattoos were the only contradiction, the dark, sprawling ink that climbed his neck and swallowed his right hand entirely. Intricate patterns that had no place in a corporate boardroom and yet somehow made him more authoritative in one, not less. No one on the executive floor commented on them. No one in any of the 12 countries where Dongtae Group operated commented on them either. Some things, Jane had learned, existed simply to remind you of the distances between people. Their dynamic had settled into something she didn't have a precise name for. It wasn't warmth, exactly. Dongtae was not a warm man, but there was a quality to the way he operated around her. A consistency, an absence of volatility that her nervous system had slowly, cautiously begun to interpret as safety. He never raised his voice at her. He never moved too quickly in her direction. He noticed when she had solved a problem before he asked, and acknowledged it with a single glance that somehow communicated more than other people's paragraphs. In 14 months, she had never once felt afraid of him. That was not a small thing. That was, for Jane Wright, an extraordinary thing. She tucked that knowledge somewhere private and got on with her work. Because gratitude was a luxury and Seoul did not wait for anyone to finish feeling their feelings. Her routine held. Her life held. Right up until the Tuesday morning it didn't. It happened between the subway exit and her apartment building, a stretch of maybe 90 meters that she had walked 270-something times without incident. A narrow residential street, lit by the amber glow of a convenience store on the corner. It was 7:40 p.m. She had stayed late to finish a logistics review. Her bag was on her left shoulder. Her keys were already in her hand, which was something she had trained herself to do years ago, in a different city, for reasons she no longer let herself name out loud. The hand came from the gap between two parked cars. She didn't scream. She had learned not to. Screaming wasted the seconds you needed to think. He spun her around before she could process the grip on her arm, and then his face was in front of hers, and the convenience store light caught the familiar lines of it. And every cell in Jane's body went absolutely, catastrophically still. Andrew, he looked like he had been traveling, or not sleeping, possibly both. His olive t-shirt was creased, and he was larger than she remembered. Or maybe fear simply scaled people up, made them take more space than they were entitled to. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing she remembered, that particular narrowing that preceded the part where he stopped using words. "Did you really think," he said, and his voice was so calm that it was its own kind of violence, "that I wouldn't find you, Andrew?" 6,000 miles, Jane. He stepped closer, backing her against the car. 6,000 miles and you're still running my logistics like I don't know every move you make. She didn't ask how he knew what she did for work. She knew better than to ask questions that wasted time. She was already measuring the distance to the corner, calculating the probability of the convenience store clerk being visible from the door, parsing whether the light on her phone screen was enough to be noticed if she managed to get her thumb to the emergency button. Andrew didn't give her the full window. The strike was fast, an open palm across her left cheekbone, vicious in its precision, the kind of hit that was designed to stun rather than mark, except that it marked her anyway, the way it always had. The way she had spent 14 months and 6,000 miles trying to forget it could. Her vision whitened at the edges. She did not fall. That was the thing about Jane Wright that Andrew had never fully understood. She did not fall. She used the second of his self-satisfaction, that microscopic pause that men like him always took to admire their own impact, and drove her elbow backward into his ribs, twisted out of the narrow space between him and the car, and walked, not ran. Walked, quickly, into the light of the convenience store, where she stood in the snack aisle under fluorescent lights with her keys cutting into her palm, her cheek screaming, and her breathing so controlled it was almost meditative. She did not look back. She bought a bottle of water she didn't drink, and waited 17 minutes before she walked the last 40 meters to her building. Upstairs, in her bathroom, she turned the light on and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she set her alarm for 5:45 a.m., 30 minutes earlier than usual, and went to bed. The concealer she used was a full coverage formula she had bought months ago for a different reason. Uneven skin tone, she had told herself in the pharmacy, though some part of her had known even then that she was buying it the way someone buys an umbrella in a city with no forecast, just in case. She applied it in layers, the way the tutorial had shown her color corrector first, the pale peach one that neutralized purple, then the concealer, then a setting powder that locked everything in place. Under the bathroom light it looked almost convincing. She tilted her face left, then right. The purple was muted. The swelling was minor enough to pass as tiredness if she wore the right expression. She wore the right expression. The commute was 22 minutes. She counted every one. The elevator in the Dongtae Group Tower opened directly onto the 40th floor executive suite, and Jane stepped out at 8:47 a.m. Into the particular quality of silence that existed up here, the hush of expensive materials and controlled air, and the awareness, constant and ambient, that every conversation on this floor mattered. She moved to her desk, opened her laptop, pulled up the Incheon distribution file, and positioned herself in the ordinary business of the morning. She was good at ordinary. Ordinary was the plan. Dongtae arrived at 9:03. She heard him before she saw him, not because he made noise, but because the quality of the air changed when he entered a room, a phenomenon she had stopped trying to explain to herself and simply accepted as a fact of her environment. She kept her eyes on her screen as his footsteps passed her desk. They stopped. She did not look up. "The overnight customs clearance," he said. "Did it go through?" "At 2:47 a.m., she said. "I flagged it in the shared system." A pause. Not the kind that meant he was processing the logistics answer. She looked up. His eyes were on her cheek. Not obviously, he was too precise for obvious, but she had spent 14 months learning to read the almost imperceptible, and what she read now was a man who had already seen what he needed to see, and was now performing the mundane so she wouldn't know it. "Good," he said. He walked into his office. The door did not close all the way. It never closed all the way when something was wrong. Jane returned her eyes to her screen and focused very hard on the Incheon numbers, while her heart knocked steadily against her ribs, and the office around her continued its pristine, expensive hum, and the concealer on her cheekbone held, and nothing happened. Nothing visible happened, but the room was approximately 4 degrees colder than it had been 30 seconds ago. She was certain of it. She was certain in the same instinctive way, She was certain of the commute time and the coffee preference and the back page first contract habit. The way you became certain of things when paying attention was how you stayed safe. Dong-tae said nothing else to her about it. Not at 9, not at 11, not at the 1 o'clock briefing where he sat across a glass table from 3 senior managers and spoke in the low, measured cadence that made people lean forward just to catch his words. And Jane sat at the end of the table with her notebook and cataloged everything and caught, once, the precise angle of his gaze sliding to the left side of her face before returning to the projector screen. Once was enough. She ate lunch at her desk. She did not taste it. The camera request went through 4 levels of bureaucracy that did not officially exist. This was not something Jane knew at the time. She would reconstruct it later, in pieces, the way you reconstruct a storm after it has already passed through. What she knew was that at 2:15 p.m., Dong-tae's chief of security, a quiet man named Park, who wore suits that were somehow both cheaper and more threatening than everyone else's, appeared briefly at the glass wall of Dong-tae's office. There was no meeting scheduled. She had Dong-tae's calendar memorized, and Park was not on it. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Park left with the particular purposefulness of a man who had received a clear instruction and intended to execute it before the hour was out. What Dong-tae had said, in that low and terrifyingly casual voice he reserved for things that were not casual at all, was this. The residential block on Mapo 2 Row, between 7:30 and 8 p.m. yesterday. Pull everything municipal cameras, building feeds, the convenience store on the corner. I want identification on the man she spoke to. I want it confirmed before I leave tonight. Park had not asked who she was. Park had worked for Dong-tae for 11 years, and understood that she, in this context, meant the person whose safety mattered. He had his own methods of discerning who that person was at any given moment, and those methods had never yet been wrong. By 4:45 p.m., a file had been compiled. It was not the kind of file that HR generated or that legal reviewed. It was the kind of file that moved through channels so far below the corporate structure that the corporate structure was simply not aware they existed. Channels that ran underneath Dong-tae Group, the way roots run underneath a building, invisible and load-bearing, and very, very deep. Park placed it on Dong-tae's desk without a word. Dong-tae read it without visible reaction. He had read much worse. He read the name Andrew Webb, 31, American national, arrived Seoul via Incheon on Sunday, cash accommodation payment in Mapo district. No registered contacts at immigration, and he read the timestamp on the camera capture that showed the moment the man's hand connected with Jane's face, and he looked at that timestamp for a very long time. Then he closed the file. He did not call Jane into his office. He did not, as Andrew Webb would have done, make the moment about the exercise of his own emotion. He picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 11 seconds, and the call was not to Park, and it was not to legal, and it was not to any of the named executives whose numbers lived in his corporate contacts. When he ended the call, he set the phone face down on the desk and returned his attention to the window and the city below it, which belonged to him in ways that were not reflected in any publicly available record. And he permitted himself exactly one thought about Andrew Webb before moving on to the logistics of what came next. The thought was not complicated. He walked into my city. He put his hands on what is mine. That was all. That was sufficient. The rest was simply scheduling. Jane made it to 6 p.m. That was the agreement she made with herself each morning in the new chapter of her life. Make it to 6. Then you can decompress. Then you can feel whatever is underneath the controlled surface. She had honored that agreement through visa complications and payroll errors and a typhoon warning last August that had genuinely tested her commitment to the principle. She honored it now, through 8 hours of concealer and cold room awareness, and a lunch she couldn't taste. And at 1 p.m., she powered down her second monitor and reached for her bag. Her phone lit up on the desk. Unknown number. Seoul area code. She answered before she'd fully decided to. The voice on the other end was not a voice. It was a recording, or it wasn't a recording, because it was too immediate, too aware of the silence on her end. It was Andrew using a new number, and what he said was short enough that she could replay it in perfect clarity the moment it ended. Nice building, good security. They wave through anyone with a visitor's badge, though. See you soon, Jane. The call ended. She sat with her hand around the phone and looked at the screen until it went dark. The Seoul skyline did its usual indifferent glitter through the glass. Somewhere in the building's lower floors, an elevator chimed. The visitor's badge. She pulled up the building's internal guest management portal. She had administrative access because she managed Dongtae's schedule and schedule management required it, and she searched the day's visitor log. With the calm efficiency of someone who had learned that controlled action was the only available antidote to controlled panic, she found it at 3:52 p.m. A visitor's badge had been issued to a Mark Webb, listed as a logistics consultant for a firm she didn't recognize, checked in at the 22nd floor meeting suite. The badge was technically still active. The 22nd floor was 4 floors below legal and 8 floors below her. For exactly 7 seconds, Jane Wright sat completely still. Then she opened Dongtae's calendar, confirmed that he was still in the building, his car hadn't been logged out, and the executive elevator hadn't registered his floor code since 2 p.m. And she did the thing that was hardest for her, the thing that went against every trained instinct she possessed, the thing that her whole architecture of survival had been specifically designed to avoid. She typed a message. He's in the building. Badge issued to the 22nd floor. His real name is Andrew Webb. She sent it to Dongtae's direct line. The response came in 40 seconds. It was 4 words. Do not leave the floor. What she did not know, what she would not know until the city lights had long since blurred into midnight, was that somewhere in the building's security infrastructure, a single elevator permission had been quietly, deliberately extended to a visitor's badge that should never have reached the 40th floor. Dongtae had not locked the door. He had opened it wider. The only question that remained was whether Andrew Webb would be foolish enough to walk through. Jane looked at those 4 words for a long moment. There was something in their brevity in the fact that he did not ask how she knew, did not ask for clarification, did not ask any of the questions an ordinary person would ask, that told her something she hadn't been quite ready to know. He already knew. He had already known since 4:45 p.m., since whatever Park had placed on his desk, since the 11-second call, and the moment the window had held his attention long enough to make whatever decision a man like Dongtae made when someone crossed a line in his city. The text wasn't new information. The text was her, finally, after 14 months of pristine professional silence asking for help, and he had already built the answer before she knew to ask the question. She set her phone down. She straightened the files on her desk. She did not go to the bathroom to check the concealer. She sat in the lit expanse of the 40th floor, her back straight, her breathing measured, and she waited not with the hollow waiting of someone who had no choice, but with something new and strange and entirely unfamiliar moving through her chest. It took her 3 full minutes to identify the feeling. It was not fear. For the first time since she had felt his hand on her face in that narrow Seoul street, for the first time in longer than she could honestly name, what Jane Wright felt was not fear. Below her, in the city's grid of neon and ambition, Andrew Webb was navigating a building he believed he had infiltrated. He was wearing a visitor's badge that bore a name almost, but not quite his own. He thought the worst thing that could happen to him was a confrontation he had scripted in his head across 6,000 miles of ocean, in which he was the largest presence in the room. He had no framework for what was actually coming. He never had. The elevator chimed at 6:44 p.m. Jane heard it from her desk, the specific tone of the executive elevator, the one that required a key code for the 40th floor, the one that should not have been accessible to a visitor's badge, issued 8 floors below. She heard it and felt the sound move through her the way cold water moves through the body, fast, total, impossible to contain. She did not run. She stood, slowly, the way Dongtae had taught her to move through this office without apology or urgency, and she turned to face the elevator bank. Andrew stepped out like he owned the floor. That was the thing about him that had always been the most dangerous. Not his size, not his hands, but the absolute unearned conviction with which he occupied space. He moved through the world as though it had been arranged for his convenience, and for 3 years she had watched that conviction override every boundary, every locked door, every 6,000-mile distance she had put between them. He was wearing the same olive t-shirt from the night before. He hadn't even changed. The audacity of that, the sheer, casual arrogance of crossing an ocean and storming a tower in yesterday's clothes, hit her somewhere between her stomach and her throat. His eyes found her immediately. He smiled, the smile that was not a smile. 40 floors, he said, walking toward her with his hands loose at his sides, the posture of a man performing relaxation for an audience of one. You always did have expensive taste. You need to leave. Her voice came out steady. She was almost surprised by it. I had to sweet-talk 3 different security guys to get up here. He looked around the office, the glass walls, the city burning 40 floors below, the clean, expensive silence of it all, and she watched him cataloging it the way he always cataloged her things, with a possessiveness that had nothing to do with appreciation. All this time I thought you were just answering phones. Turns out you landed yourself quite the setup. Andrew. Who is he? The smile dropped. The real face underneath was always faster to arrive than people expected. This Dong Tae. Who is he to you? My employer. Don't. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and she moved backward, instinctively, hating herself for the instinct even as she obeyed it, until the backs of her thighs met the low credenza beneath the window, and there was nowhere left to go. The city sprawled behind her, 40 floors of empty air, and Andrew was close enough now that she could see the vein in his jaw that appeared when he was working toward something he had decided in advance. I flew 6,000 miles, Jane. I think I deserve a real answer. You deserve nothing from me. His hand came up toward her face, not to strike this time, but to grip, to reclaim. And she turned her head away and pressed her palms flat against the credenza and breathed. Because breathing was the only thing she could control. Because Dong Tae had said, do not leave the floor, and she had stayed, and she had to trust that those 4 words meant something. The office lights changed. It was subtle. A dimming, almost imperceptible, from the overhead panels to the ambient city glow flooding through the glass. Andrew noticed it a half-second after Jane did, and in that half-second his grip on her jaw loosened by exactly enough. She stepped to the side, and Dong Tae walked out of the shadows of the inner office corridor like he had never been anywhere else. He had been there, she would understand later, for longer than she knew. He had been standing in the corridor that connected his private office to the main suite, in the dark, watching not with the voyeurism of someone who enjoyed her fear, but with the patience of someone who needed the full picture before he chose his moment. He had needed Andrew to make the move. He had needed the threat to be undeniable, documented in the architecture of the moment, witnessed by the city lights and the glass and the air between them. He stepped into the room now with no urgency whatsoever. That was the thing that made Andrew go still. Not the tattoos, though they were fully visible now, the ink crawling up Dong Tae's neck above the open collar of his dark dress shirt, the patterns covering his right hand where it hung relaxed at his side. Not the suit, which was worth more than Andrew made in a month. It was the complete, absolute absence of hurry. Dong Tae moved like a man who had already decided how this ended, and found the intervening moments mildly interesting at best. He walked past Andrew without acknowledging him. He walked directly to Jane. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face, really looked, the way he had not permitted himself to look in the office that morning with its professional distances and its performance of normalcy. He looked at the concealer she had applied in the bathroom at 6:15 a.m., and what remained of it now after 9 hours. And he looked at the bruise beneath it, the purple red spread across her left cheekbone that all the full coverage formula in Seoul had not fully erased. Then he raised his right hand slowly, with a deliberateness that was its own language, and with the tattooed back of his fingers, with a touch so careful it barely qualified as contact, he tilted her chin upward toward the light. She let him. She looked at him, and she let him, and something in her chest that had been clenched since 7:40 p.m. the previous night released a single, incremental degree. That's enough. Andrew's voice came from 3 meters away, loud with the particular bravado of a man who was beginning, on some animal level, to sense that he had miscalculated but had not yet admitted it to his conscious mind. Get your hands off her. She, Dong Tae said, without turning around, without raising his voice by a single decibel, is not part of your sentence. The room went very quiet. Dongtae's thumb traced barely the edge of the bruise on Jane's cheek. His eyes stayed on hers, not in the way of men who perform tenderness for an audience, but in the way of someone conducting an inventory, cataloging the damage with the focused attention of a person who intended to account for every item on the list. "Does it hurt?" he asked, and his voice in that register was something she had never heard before, quiet enough to be private, even in a room with a third person in it. She considered lying. It was her first instinct. It had always been her first instinct. "Yes," she said instead. He nodded once, the nod of a man receiving a report. Then he turned around. He looked at Andrew the way he looked at problems that had already been solved, with a distant, almost academic attention, the engagement of someone reviewing a closed file. Andrew was large. He was muscular and imposing, and he had spent 3 years using those facts like currency, spending them freely against a woman who had been trained by his own behavior to find size frightening. He was accustomed to being the largest presence in any room he entered. He was not the largest presence in this room. This was not about physical scale. It was something else entirely, the specific, terrible gravity of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to prove what he was capable of, because the people who mattered already knew, and the people who didn't know learned quickly and did not require a second lesson. Andrew opened his mouth. From the far corner of the office, where the shadows between the server cabinet and the interior wall had appeared to be simply shadows, a hand emerged and landed on Andrew's shoulder. It was a large hand. It belonged to a man in a dark suit who had been standing in that corner for, Jane would calculate later, at least 20 minutes. His face was composed and professional and entirely, serenely unbothered. His grip on Andrew's shoulder was not violent. It was simply immovable, the way a structural wall is immovable, a fact of the architecture rather than an act of aggression. Andrew tried to turn. The hand didn't allow significant movement. The terror arrived then properly, visibly, in the way Jane had seen it arrive in his face once before, years ago, in a situation that had briefly made him understand consequences, before he forgot. But that had been a minor understanding, a preliminary draft. What moved across his face now was the full, final edition. The absolute comprehension that he was not the apex of this situation, had never been the apex of this situation, and that the door through which he had walked 40 minutes ago, with a borrowed visitor's badge and an ocean's worth of arrogance, had closed behind him in ways that had nothing to do with hinges. Dongtae crossed the room toward him unhurriedly. He stopped at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate, and far enough to make Andrew aware that the proximity was a choice, not a necessity. "You flew," Dongtae said. 6,000 miles. Andrew said nothing. The hand on his shoulder was a persuasive argument for silence. "You found her address. You found her building. You found her employer." Each sentence landed with the flat, even weight of an itemized invoice. "You waited in the street like a man who believes patience is the same thing as power. You struck her." A pause. "And then you came here." He tilted his head by a fraction of a degree. "I want you to understand something," Dongtae said. "Not because I require you to understand it, but because I find it useful for a man to know precisely where he went wrong before he loses the ability to reflect on it." Andrew's jaw worked. No sound came out. "You were allowed in this building," Dongtae said. "The badge, the security, the elevator code that a visitor's clearance should not have accessed. All of it." He paused, letting that settle. "I needed you here. I needed you to feel, for the length of this evening, that you were the one making moves. That is the last time in your life you will feel that way." He looked at Andrew the way he looked at the city from his window, from a great height, without judgment, simply assessing. "In my city," he said, "a man who raises his hand to a woman under my protection does not raise that hand again. This is not a threat. Threats imply uncertainty about the outcome." He turned away from Andrew entirely, as though the sentence was complete and the subject closed. He walked back to Jane. Behind him, the enforcer's grip on Andrew's shoulder shifted a small adjustment that communicated, with perfect physical clarity, that the conversation was over and the next phase of the evening was beginning. Andrew found his voice. "You can't. The elevator. Dongtae said to the enforcer. "Will be available in 3 minutes." The enforcer nodded and began walking Andrew toward the elevator bank. Andrew stumbled. He had the look of a man trying to locate a version of this situation in which he retained some agency, searching rapidly through every available framework and finding none that applied. "Jane," he tried, twisting back. She looked at him. For the first time, standing in the lit expanse of a room that was not her sanctuary but had become it anyway, with the bruise on her cheek and her hands perfectly still at her sides. She looked at Andrew Webb without flinching, without shrinking, without performing the invisibility she had spent years perfecting for his benefit. She said nothing. That was the answer. The silence was the answer. The steadiness of her gaze was the answer. And she watched it land on him the way Dongtae's words had landed, with weight, with finality, with the particular force of things that could not be taken back. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. Andrew was walked inside. The doors closed. The 40th floor returned to its expensive silence, and somewhere in the machinery of the building, in the channels that ran underneath its corporate structure like roots beneath a foundation, a sequence of events began that Andrew Webb would not have the vocabulary to describe, even if he had later been in a position to try. He was not, later, in a position to try. Dongtae moved to the bar cabinet beside his desk. Dark wood, no visible brand, the kind of restraint that costs more than ostentation, and poured 2 glasses of something amber without asking for a preference. He set one on the edge of the desk closest to Jane and took his own to the window. For a moment he simply stood there, looking at Sol. She picked up the glass. Her hands were steady. She noted the steadiness with something adjacent to pride. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. She sat in the chair across from his desk, not the visitor's chair, but the chair she occupied during their daily briefings, the one that had become, through repetition and the quiet legitimacy of routine, her chair. She held the glass in both hands and waited, because she had spent 14 months learning to read the quality of Dongtae's silences, and this one was gathering itself toward something. He turned from the window. "The Incheon logistics account," he said. "The quarterly redistribution schedules you've been managing, the supplier contact lists, the customs clearance flags you've been filing for the past 14 months. She looked at him. "They are not," he said. "For a real estate conglomerate." The glass was cool in her palms. The city burned in the window behind him. She heard the sentence, and then she heard it again in the interior of her mind, and she began, with the methodical efficiency that was the truest expression of who she was, to re-examine 14 months of work through a different lens. The supplier names that never appeared in any public registry. The distribution routes that mapped to ports rather than properties. The clearance flags she had filed with a precision she had assumed was simply what this level of corporate operation required, the discretion expected. As the job posting had said, discretion expected. And she had delivered it without question, because discretion was its own form of armor, and she had understood that requirement on a frequency deeper than professional. She had been managing the distribution lines of a criminal empire. She had been doing it flawlessly, for 14 months. "You knew," she said. "It was not an accusation. It was an audit finding. I hired you because you were exceptional," he said, with the directness that was simply his native mode. That she had mistaken early on for coldness, and had come to understand was actually its opposite, a form of respect so fundamental he didn't ornament it. And because you asked no unnecessary questions, those 2 qualities are rare in combination. I should have asked questions. Yes. He sat down across from her, and this was unusual enough Dongtae at rest, at the level of the room rather than above it that she paid close attention. You should have. I'm telling you now so that you don't have to ask them in the wrong order. She looked at the amber in her glass. What happens now? That, he said, depends on what you want. It was such an unexpected sentence from him that she almost didn't process it. In her experience, men with power did not ask that question. They told you what happened next, and framed it as your preference. You have a choice, he said, and his voice was its usual low, even register. But there was something underneath it. Not warmth, precisely, but its structural equivalent. Stability, bedrock, something that would not move. You can leave. Full severance, relocation assistance, documentation that protects you. I will not contact you, and no aspect of my operation will reach you. That is one option. She waited. The other option, he said, is that you stop pretending to be an assistant. The city glittered. Somewhere 40 floors below, an elevator was making a descent that would end before midnight. She did not think about what came after that elevator reached the ground. She thought about 14 months of precision and discretion, and work that had been, in a professional sense, the finest of her life. She thought about the visitor's log, and the 4-word text, and the tattooed hand that had touched her bruise with the kind of careful attention that most people reserved for things they valued past the capacity to replace. I want to understand the full scope of the operation, she said. Before I decide. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the acknowledgement of an answer that had been, in his estimation, the correct one. Then we'll need another drink, he said. He poured it. She did not go home that night until nearly midnight. She walked the 90 meters from her building's entrance to her front door without checking over her shoulder. Not because the fear was gone, she understood herself well enough to know that fear, like hers, did not simply evaporate, that it retreated by degrees, and that degrees were enough. But Andrew Webb was not behind her in the amber streetlight. He was not between the parked cars. He would not be calling from unknown numbers or standing in skyways wearing borrowed badges. She knew that with a certainty she did not examine too closely. She slept without setting an alarm. She arrived the next morning at 8:47 a.m. She had stood in the bathroom at 6:30 and looked at the bruise in the mirror. It was fading, still visible, a yellowed purple at the center of her cheekbone, the edges softening into the surrounding skin. She had picked up the concealer and held it for a moment, the sponge in her other hand. Then she set it down. She chose a different foundation, the ordinary one, her daily one, the one that evened her skin tone without hiding it, that made her face look like her face and not a surface she was managing. She applied it with the same efficiency she applied to everything, and looked at herself in the result, the bruise, visible, real, fading at the pace bruises faded, which was its own kind of truth, and she found that she could look at it without the familiar cascade of shame. It was evidence of something that had happened to her. It was also evidence that she was still here, in this apartment, in this city, in this life she had built with her own exceptional, underestimated hands. She walked out. The commute was 22 minutes. She counted none of them. The elevator opened onto the 40th floor, and she stepped out into the executive suite and moved to her desk with the same unhurried competence she brought to every morning, except that it was not the same. And they both knew it. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the operational files she had spent 14 months managing under one understanding and would now manage under another, truer one. She made 2 notations she had not been authorized to make the previous week and that she was authorized to make now. She did not second-guess them. At 9:01, the executive elevator opened. Dongtae crossed the floor. His suit was charcoal today, the dress shirt beneath it the same black, the tattoos doing what they always did in the office light existing, without apology, as simply part of the architecture of him. He moved past the junior staff. He moved past the account managers and the legal coordinator and the glass wall of the conference room. He stopped at her desk. She looked up. His eyes went to her cheek, the bruise, uncovered, present, fading but real. He looked at it for 1.5 seconds, the same duration as the morning before, and this time she did not look away, did not regulate her expression toward professional neutrality, did not perform invisibility. She met his eyes. Something passed between them in the economy of that look, an accounting, a closing of certain ledgers and an opening of others, a renegotiation conducted entirely without language because they were both, in their different ways, people who understood that the most important agreements rarely required words. He set a single folder on the edge of her desk. The Busan account, he said, in his usual low register. The restructuring needs your assessment by Thursday. The current logistics architecture is inefficient. She looked at the folder. The Busan account had previously sat 3 levels above her official clearance. I'll have it by Wednesday, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then he walked into his office. The door did not close all the way, but that was not unusual. That was simply how things were on this floor, the particular permeability of a space in which two people had reached, without ceremony or announcement, an arrangement. The junior staff continued at their stations. The city performed its ambition beyond the glass. Jane Wright opened the Busan folder, uncapped her pen, and went to work, not as an assistant, not as a woman managing her own invisibility, not as someone waiting for the next thing to survive. She went to work as what she had been, without knowing it, for 14 months, and what she would now be with full knowledge and full intention, an exceptional, dangerous, untouchable mind at the center of an empire, in a city that did not know her name yet but would, and a bruise fading on her cheek like the last evidence of a door she had finally, permanently, closed behind her.